Hello, hello. We are live. And I'm going to be discussing an interesting new study that I found that discusses the implications of political partisanship, particularly political extremism as an identity. It was found that progressives, extremely progressive people, are least likely to help people who are outside of their political group, which is quite ironic if you are familiar with the progressive signs that people put outside their homes. And so we're going to get into that. So welcome to this live stream. It is a recurring live stream that I will be doing. You can keep up with that at wetheblacksheep.com. My name is Salome Siboney. I'm a writer, artist, speaker, and co-founder of the publication The Black Sheep, which is dedicated to individualism and combating groupthink, which is exactly what this study is about, groupthink. So let me pull up some details here because we got a lot to get into. What I ultimately want to talk about is the mistake of attaching to political identities as opposed to values. And this is a mistake that I made once in my life. And so I know very well how this can lead you to do the opposite of what you think your political identity conveys. And so in this study, which we will get into in more detail, you have people who identify as extremely progressive being less likely to help people simply because, in this study, the subject has a Blue Lives Matter shirt on. And so this shows that people who are really attached to that progressive ideology don't feel as inclined to help people who aren't part of their in-group. And of course, this seems totally counter to an ideology that touts itself as being uniquely empathetic, uniquely caring about people. And that's the danger with political identities, is that they are not a substitute for having values and for pursuing those values. And I think this is a mistake that a lot of people are making as our culture becomes more politically polarized and political identities become these tools for us to signal morality to each other, which is also something that's amplified by social media. And as we do this signaling, it's very easy to forget that you have to act your morality out, not just signal what you think your morality is. So let's get into the study. Let me pull it up here. I'm not going to get super in the weeds on this because it is in the weeds, and I want to keep, there's multi-levels that I want to discuss here, which is political identities, which are group identities, versus individualism. I want to give you my experience with how I fell into that trap. And I also want to talk about values and how we actually can use these as opposed to relying on political identities as kind of like this secondhand way to connect with our values. And so let me pull up the study just so I can give you some information on it. The study is called Political Polarization, In-Group Bias, and Helping Behavior. Do we help others who are, quote unquote, on the other political team? The study, I believe, is led by Glenn Geher. And of course, as usual, has a long list of other people who contributed to this. We will have the study up for you on wetheblacksheep.com. So make sure that you're subscribed because there will also be many other live streams like this that I think you'll enjoy. And I'm going to be trying to monitor the comments and the questions and all that stuff. Hold on. Looks like I'm not live on Twitter for some reason. What is going on here? Not live on Twitter. Is this correct? Provide me information. Somebody. I think this is it. It looks live. Somebody explain. You're scheduled for the okay, I'm scheduled for the wrong day on Twitter. Alrighty, let's get that going. Jake, come down here and fix it. In the meantime, I'm going to keep talking about the study a little bit. So the study is based around like, will people help someone that's wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt versus will they help someone wearing a Blue Lives Matter shirt? Okay, give us a minute. I'm going to go live on Twitter also, so let's fix that. Be right back. All right, we're back. We're back in action. Technical difficulties as is normal with human life and technology. All right, so thank you, Anna. I'm very excited to share the research. I'm glad that you're excited too, because I just love when a study confirms what we kind of know, you know? I think we all kind of knew that those really overzealous yard signs that tell us how awesome and moral and ethical and wonderful the people inside the house are probably a little bit of an overcompensation. And what's so interesting about this study is that it shows not only could you maybe say that those signs don't correlate with whether the person in that house is actually a helpful person, it might have an inverse correlation. That is to say, those overzealous yard signs that tell you what a good person the homeowner is might actually mean the opposite. That this person is more likely not to help you if you aren't in their political tribe. Okay, so let me pull up the research, and I'm just going to recount some of the main findings here. And really quickly, I'll just repeat. Political polarization, in-group bias, and helping behavior. Do we help others who are on the other political team? So here are some of the key findings from this study. So important. People from one political orientation were not more likely to help than people in the other political orientation. So that is, conservatives and progressives seem to be equally helpful to strangers overall. The targets who donned the Blue Lives Matter shirt were no less or more likely to receive help than the targets who wore the Black Lives Matter shirt. And there was significant statistical interaction. People who identified as highly progressive were much less likely to help the target with the Blue Lives Matter shirt. The converse was not found for conservative participants. They were just as likely to help the target regardless of whether that target identified with the Blue Lives Matter or the Black Lives Matter movement. And so this study has an interesting other element to it, which is called the light triad and the dark triad. So these are two personality constellations of traits that can explain certain predispositions toward bad behavior or good behavior. And so, as the name suggests, the light triad tends to correlate with more pro-social behavior, whereas the dark triad tends to correlate with more anti-social behavior. So, all three facets of the light triad, which is faith in humanity, Kantianism, and humanism, were positively correlated to helping, regardless of experimental conditions. That is, people who were high on the light triad of personality are relatively helpful to strangers, regardless of politics. So this comes into the values discussion that we will get into here shortly, which is there are a lot of people who identify with progressive politics, but still have values, and that guides them. And thus, they are probably likely to be higher in the light triad, which is faith in humanity, humanistic beliefs. And those are the things that actually correlate with them helping people more. It's not how progressive you are, but for example, how much faith in humanity you have, how much you identify with the idea of humanism that correlates with whether you're going to help people regardless of their political affiliation. And of course, you say these things and it's like, that's why some of these studies are fun, but also obvious, because it just makes sense that you can't replace your values with a political ideology because that's so broad. But equally, that's why when you value a political identity so much to the degree that you think you know whether all the people of a broad political group are good people or bad people, it affects your behavior to the degree that you might not help someone if you think that they're not in your political tribe. And so to this end, one of the facets of the dark triad, which is interesting, narcissism, was negatively related to helping a stranger. So this adds, narcissists, regardless of context, seem to not be interested in helping strangers. So let's go over to my notes so that we can discuss this more. Because what I thought was so interesting about this study was that it just confirms what I think a lot of us are getting tired of, which is people who think they can judge others for their worth, for their goodness, solely based on a political label. And I think that this has happened more and more as we've migrated online, where you actually have very little to be able to judge people by because you only have what they put out. And that's how you get these bios where they're full of flags and full of like political identifiers and causes, because that's the way that people can let you know that they're a good person, that they care about the right things. And so in turn, people come to believe that that's how you can judge someone, by their political affiliation. And it's a really sad thing because, of course, when you have something as broad as progressive or conservative, a lot of people identify with these labels and they haven't really thought it through that much. They just like the vibes, or they have been raised in a certain social setting where that is the more common belief system. And so they take those social cues and adopt that belief system because it's the path of least resistance to fitting in with their peers. And why not? It seems good. They have not done the extensive study necessary to really judge a political ideology on its merits. A lot of people do that. Like, politics is not, at least at once upon a time, was not people's main lens for the world. And in many ways, it's very unhealthy that that is becoming a lot of people's main lens. And you can see it in the fact that this study shows that that kind of extreme tendency towards at least progressive ideology influences how you act in the world in a negative way, which I find so fascinating. So I'm trying to get my notes up here because they are not showing. Just a moment. Okay, so let's talk about how this correlates with the black sheep concept, because it's probably no surprise that extreme progressives don't want to help people who they perceive as being conservative. But the psychology that's at play there is one of political tribalism and one of group identities being the more salient factor, which is the problem when you have this kind of framework that someone exists within where they think that if you're wearing a Blue Lives Matter shirt, I know all I need to know about you. And it's very easy to get into that mindset now because even on the right, people who would identify more with the Blue Lives Matter slogan and be more at odds with the Black Lives Matter slogan, I'm sure people have like a growing distaste where they see certain things like, oh, blue hair, huh? You probably like one of those. And it's very easy to fall into that trap where we start using these like symptoms and like physical signals to decide what tribe someone is in. And while it makes sense to take note of things like that, when you make it something that you take action upon, like deciding I'm not going to help someone because they're wearing such and such political shirt, so I know everything that they're about. One, I think it's very odd because you're losing out on an opportunity to be an example of why your political philosophy is good. Instead, you're proving the opposite, at least indirectly. And you actually have a chance to represent that ideology if you interact with people of a different belief. So that's the odd thing with this kind of like political tribalism. It's not the same as genuine political advocacy, which requires conversation, which actually requires you to interact with and listen to people of different political views. Political tribalism is this us versus them mentality where it's a very zero-sum game and people often aren't actually trying to persuade anyone. That's why they treat people of the political out-group like shit, because they're way past that idea of like, oh, if I just explain my beliefs, maybe that they'll see the merit in them. They don't believe in persuasion. They believe in getting to force their ideology on others. And so why would they waste time trying to talk to someone that they disagree with? And so, of course, this kind of political tribalism doesn't just affect people who are of the opposing political view. What I found really interesting about this study is that it recaps some previous research that builds the case for understanding why political polarization is increasing, how political polarization increases our tendency to identify with our in-group and to demonize the out-group. And one of those studies that is relevant to this is the research on the black sheep effect, which is partly what informs my work on the black sheep concept. So I thought this was really interesting because black sheep are people who tend to not be as concerned with the social cues and the acceptance from their group. They tend to have already a certain set of values that rank higher than just social signaling or social acceptance. Oftentimes that value is something like truth or excellence or simply the functionality of the thing that they were in the group to begin with for. So think of someone who is a teacher. And we actually have an essay from someone like this on the black sheep, and someone who is a teacher who genuinely cares about educating students in a way that helps them to think clearly and independently. This person is a minority in a group of educators who become influenced by an ideology that is about social signaling that you have the right ideas and you are part of this good group. Now, that black sheep educator is going to see that this ideology doesn't actually help students. I can see it. I got into education because I wanted to help students think more clearly, more independently. This ideology doesn't do that. So I'm going to question it and question why it's becoming more ingrained in my schooling institution. That's the black sheep effect, when inevitably that group of educators that's now beholden to this ideology lashes out at that educator who is still doing what they went into education to do. This is what's so fascinating about the black sheep effect to me, is that you have this kind of like majority versus minority dynamic, where it's often the minority that has just stayed true to what they cared about to begin with, and find themselves now surrounded by people who have changed because the social cues have changed, and they were originally more susceptible to pursuing social acceptance and fitting in with social norms. And so they all changed while this person remains the same. Now that person, simply by way of remaining the same, becomes a threat, because the fact that they aren't going along with this new change in the group brings the group's change into question. And so the black sheep effect is the finding that that person will be treated more harshly than who the group views as an actual enemy. So you can think of this as like progressives who, despite saying that conservatives are evil, take more time and express even more hostility to progressives or liberals who push back on some of the norms that are developing or some of the ideas within that group. That person gets more harsh treatment than the opposing political group, because that person is actually more positioned to threaten the group because they're closer to it. And because by way of being part of that group, they hold a mirror to the fact that it's the group that has changed, not that individual who was in the group. And so this study talks more about opposing political groups. It talks about the fact that extreme progressives are less likely to help people outside their political group more than any of the other political groups that were tested. And not just progressives, but extreme progressives. And so what that shows is that it's not just progressivism, it's the extreme attachment to it as a political identity. And it's not like, you know, if you think of our country and our culture and the history of politics in the United States, it's not like leftism or progressivism was invented just within the last 20 years where things got crazy. What is more likely to have changed, and what I have seen change, is that the attachment to these labels as an identity and as a way to signal your values and as a way to differentiate yourself from other political groups has skyrocketed. And like I said, I think that that's a good deal in part because of the way that social media functions, where it's very much this like, show don't tell, but in the worst way, which is like put the flags in your bio, but don't actually ever do anything in the real world. Just tell everybody that you are a good person. Don't take the time to be a good person. And so this kind of situation is really snowballing now. And so a study like this is really interesting because more so than just like, oh, I disagree with progressivism, I think it's an inherently flawed ideology, it identifies that that's not necessarily the problem, which I think is actually kind of great news, because what is the solution? Like, oh, we got to get rid of all progressive ideology in the country? Like, it's not going to happen. But what we can do is dissuade people and highlight the destructiveness of attaching to a political identity in lieu of having an actual value system. So I'm going to look into the chat right now and see if we have any comments, because my screen is all messed up. Okay. Yes, Will Roosh is the person I am talking about in terms of that educator. Good catch, Noah. Black sheep in the know will know. That was one of our I think our debut essay on the black sheep, actually. Anna says, the thing I have noticed about the polarizing sides, we all seem to have the same fundamental wants, but the divide has been so powerful lately. Oh my gosh, that's so true. And that's one of the things that I think really needs more attention, because it's the extremes that make it so hard for the more normal, moderate people to have a discussion and to find common ground, because you really have like people, at least when I was a leftist, and I still see this on the left, they demonize the idea of doing that kind of cooperation and common ground. The idea is that, oh no, anybody that's not a leftist is so evil that to cooperate with them is to do evil yourself, which is just like, so then what is the alternative? The alternative seems pretty evil too. So I don't know about that. I think I'm going to stick with the thing that has made conflict resolve peacefully forever, which is actual cooperation and the seeking of common ground. And the crazy thing is, like, we have these discussions and it's like there's tons of research and historical examples to show that this is what is necessary to avoid conflict and destruction and regressive ideologies flourishing in response to other regressive ideologies, but somehow we keep having the same conversations. So let me look over into some of the other chats here. I know we got the Instagram chat going. Feel free to leave your values in the chat. I'm very curious what your values are, because I think that's something we don't talk about enough. And I'm going to get there soon. We'll discuss values and how to adopt them and how to live by them more. And I'd like to be able to go through the chat and just see, like, what are your top values or your top number one value? Okay. Let's see. If you are in the Twitter chat, I don't know if I can see comments. I don't know how this works here. Oh, I just messed it up so bad. All right, so let's keep it moving. So I want to talk to you about my story of being a fool. Okay, now I see the Twitter comments. Hello, you are heard, you are seen. You are in the chat now. This perfectly describes cult behavior, where cults ostracize those who stray or leave the group, and this is true of people of any extreme political identity. When you subtract from that sense of virtue, you delegitimize their own. And yes, quote unquote, othering is a way to put people into categories, themselves and others ranked by virtue. Exactly. This is, you hear a lot like the left is a cult, and it sounds hyperbolic, but when you get to that level of extreme political tribalism, it does function like a cult in many ways. You might not have like a faith claim where, oh, Stalin is gonna come back to Earth and take us all to the heavens, the utopia where there is free money and food for everyone forever. But there is that policing of, you're either in or you're out. You're with us or you're against us. And then you have these really toxic mechanisms, which I just kind of like, it's weird. I feel like people know this because I know it, but then I think maybe that's a flawed assumption, because often you think that just because you know something that everybody knows it. And I know a lot of us in watching this live stream know it, but the degree to which some political, they're political cults, ultimately. They function in the same way, where you have to toe the line and you have to be loyal to the group, or you become an enemy of the group. And worse than a traditional outside enemy of someone who never was part of the group, you get the harshest treatment because you are made an example to those who might be questioning. And that's how you get this kind of like really dangerous treadmill of political extremism, where it's just like, how can I constantly keep proving that I'm the most enthusiastic member of this group. And so it's like, okay, if some people say that, I don't care so much that the insurance CEO got killed, the next person says, I like it. And then the next person says, I loved it. And then the next person says, I think we should kill all the CEOs. And it just keeps building there, because what that group is built around isn't actually the pursuit of a functional goal, which is, okay, healthcare reform. That's what we're trying to do. Here's how we're trying to do it. Here's what we want to see done. It's not that. It's like a club, very much like a cult, where the point of the group is to be in the group. And so that's what all the things that the group does serve, which is to show, are you in the group or are you not? And so there's this constant competition within the group to show how in the group you are. And it's so unhealthy, because it just naturally leads to more and more extremism, which is exactly what this study was describing. It's a really important note that it's not all progressives that, like just progressives in general, that were resistant to helping non-progressives. It was the progressives who identified as extremely progressive. And so that's such a warning against that kind of like really overzealous attachment to political ideology as an identity. So let me pull up some of my notes now so we can talk about that. So this is partly why I founded the Black Sheep and write about this Black Sheep concept, because individualism is the way out of that desire for an identity that starts to lead you into an overzealous group identity. And so a lot of these kind of collectivist ideologies, they give people an identity that isn't earned. You get to just say, I'm a compassionate person, I'm an ethical person, I'm this, that, and the other, simply by slapping the label progressive or conservative onto yourself without having to actually do anything. And that is both a danger to your society, your community, but also to yourself. Because in my experience, when I fell for this trap, when I was younger and did not have an identity, did not know what I believed in, and was looking for ways to assuage the immense anxiety that comes with not knowing what you believe in and not knowing really what you even want out of life, then you find this ideology where it's like, oh, wow, these people all say that they're the good guys, and they say so much how everybody else is the bad guys. And wow, they treat the bad guys really bad. I wouldn't want to be on that side of that. This looks maybe like I can be part of this group and suddenly get this identity as one of the good guys. And then all I have to start doing is attacking the bad guys. And then I get to be a good guy. And so it's this really simplistic shortcut to gaining a sense of identity, but it's not actually an identity. And this is what's so difficult about people who have their identity tied up into their politics to such a degree, is that you can't talk to them about anything that contradicts that political ideology because it's their identity. And so, of course, we have seen the protection mechanisms spring up for people that identify so heavily with their ideology, which is silence is violence. Words are violence. Trigger warnings. I need trigger warnings. We need safe spaces. This movie, this book, this song, this idea does harm. It should be pushed out of sight because it does harm. Maybe not to me, but to someone. And that matters because I am fragile, because my entire identity is wrapped up in this ideology, and anything that threatens that threatens me. And this is what I experienced when I was a leftist too, because that's partly what was pulling me in, was that I didn't have my own identity yet. I hadn't thought through the process of choosing my values and thinking them through, which is, in my opinion, that's going to the source. I see political ideology as like a secondary proxy type of situation to get you to values without actually even knowing necessarily what those values are. A lot of the times people may be like me, like I was, which is they're not even really that familiar with the concept of values, let alone the practice of intentionally deciding, what are my values? Let me take the time to consider what my values are and develop a framework I can return to judge my own behavior and say, I say that I value compassion, but I don't help people who are of different political groups. Do I really value compassion? Is that compassionate? And that's what's so much more effective and clarifying about having values that you can name, as opposed to pointing at a political ideology and saying, well, my values are progressivism and all the things that it entails. And it's like, well, what does that mean? Because then once you boil it down and you say, well, my value is empathy. Now you have to judge your actions and say, is that action empathetic? And at that point, you've either got to really double down on lying to yourself, or you have an opportunity to make a change and choose a different action that is more aligned. This is ultimately what happened to me. So let's get into my story time, and then we will talk more about values, which leads into this. For me, when I was younger and still kind of like building my identity and figuring out what I wanted to do with my life, very confused time in my life, leftism felt like a persona that I could put on. And it gave me this certainty where it was like, oh, now I have the answers to everything. And if I just double down, or I can just denigrate and dismiss the people that disagree with it as being bad people, now I have this protection, this shell, this like suit of armor that I can wear. And it's so interesting to see the way a lot of people comport themselves when they're really captured by political ideologies, because it is often this like really intense display of like aggression and hostility to outgroup members, which it's like, you seem like you're scared. And that's what's so interesting about that behavior that correlates with political tribalism, is that deep down, the extremism usually is linked to fear that the person will be found out as not really who they say they are, or not as competent as they're pretending to be, or not as empathetic or compassionate as they claim to be. Fear that they are hiding behind this ideology and actually they're flawed, they're weak, they're afraid. And so it's a very simple psychological idea that one extreme tends to overcompensate for another. And so you see this kind of like intense display of aggression and hostility, and it's usually from people that actually are deeply afraid and insecure. And so for someone in their 20s who doesn't know what they want out of life and who doesn't know who they are, being able to put on that suit of armor and perform certainty, perform confidence is a very easy trap to fall in. And fall I did. And so it took me some time to really reckon with the fact that this isn't helping me. This ideology and affiliating myself with it isn't helping me get where I want to go in life. And it took hitting a small rock bottom, you know, crying in your car in the parking lot, kind of rock bottom, to be willing to change. And by change, it really just meant like, I'm going to start doing something different. I'm just going to start taking different actions. And this was so interesting because it's like a very subtle way to change. It's just like, I'm just going to start writing. I'm going to start writing about the things that I care about. And I was not as afraid of, at the time, the people that were going to come after me and insult me and attack me, and like the brewing cancel culture that we didn't even have a name for during the time when I was facing it. And I just decided, I was like, it's so miserable living the way that I'm living. I'm just going to do something different. I'm going to do what I want. And if no one understands it and if people hate it, then whatever. And turns out that is exactly what I needed to do, because that was action aligned with what I actually cared about. And I didn't realize that at the time, because I still didn't have this developed concept of values and acting based on my values, as opposed to what I had fallen into was thinking that I could just attach to a political ideology and I would, like, by osmosis absorb all these qualities that said ideology supposedly imbues its members with. But that wasn't working. It does not work. And so what you end up having is two different outcomes there. Some people will double down and continually get more overzealous in their politics as a way to quiet that feeling that this isn't working. And that's where you get into what this study finds, which is people who are extreme in their political identity, particularly for progressivism, which I have a feeling, I have theories on that. I would posit that just knowing how people tend to come to progressivism, which is like, they really they do have some kind of like an empathetic center, but they're also probably higher in agreeableness, so they actually do kind of care what others think about them, as a way to, like, be nice, which is true to my experience in some facets. I would imagine that people find themselves in this kind of like extreme progressivism where they uniquely are the ones that are not willing to help people outside of their outgroup, as opposed to extreme conservatives, which, by the way, is just so funny. It's just so funny because it's so contrary to the rhetoric that they will tell you, which is, again, like, everything hides behind its opposite. It's incredible. It's like the very people who will tell you till they're blue in the face that it's conservatives who are going to put women in chain, and it's the Trump voters who are going to destroy this earth and kill us all. They are the single ones in this study who were not willing to help people outside their outgroup. It wasn't conservatives. So it's just one of those things that it's like poetic justice in a way. But nonetheless, so you have that kind of like split where some people just end up getting more and more extreme because it's not working. And so they just double down on what's not working. And then you have what I luckily did, which was realize this isn't working. I'm just going to try something different. And I kind of stumbled into realizing that the actions you take are more important than the labels you apply to yourself, which is not revolutionary, but when you're 21 and don't know what the hell you're doing, it is. And so let's talk a little bit more about that process, because I thought it was so fascinating that this study really mirrored what I went through, because I remember being a leftist, and really, like, one of the turning points for me was when I was accidentally so mean to someone, and it was just so clear that they didn't understand it because they weren't immersed in like the weird leftist jargon world that I was. So it was just like, you just sound like a jerk. And so I remember I was visiting my boyfriend at the time, and we were staying with his mom, and his mom was just like the nicest person ever. And at this point I was in my like, white people are bad era of leftism. God forgive me. All y'all forgive me. And of course, why was I in that era? Because I was very uncomfortable with my identity as someone of like mixed background, and feeling overly sensitive about what that would mean for me in this leftist subculture that I was in, where people are ranked by their identity and where your rights to speak on things get revoked based on your identity. So of course, what position does that put someone like me, who is just like trying to navigate this flawed system, it puts me in the defensive, which is like, okay, so I'm going to differentiate myself from the lowest people on the hierarchy, which is the white people, by denigrating the white people and playing up my Latina-ness. You're welcome. You're welcome for the insights into the ugly psychology of someone that was doing this. But because I could very easily just be like, oh yeah, I was once a leftist. I don't remember. But this is the reality. It's just not, it's not a good mental place. And it's, I would love if we get to the point where we stop treating like at least a certain variety of leftism as a political ideology and treat it more as like a psychological condition, not like a mental illness per se. I'm not being like hyperbolic, but really like, I think when you have this confluence of unhealthy traits, like being very insecure, like having an external locus of control, which means you think that your life is determined by things that are out of your control, like having a kind of like antisocial inclination, which is like, I think people are bad, like not being a humanistic type of person. And then also having like this kind of resentment that I should be in a better position. I should have such and such, but not having this sense of agency to go and get those things and not being willing even to earn those things because you think you're entitled to them. Like there are this confluence of traits and predispositions that kind of like lead you to leftism, at least if you're exposed to it and in a certain, certain other details. And I think that that's in some ways so much more, clarifying for what leftism is and like how it can really negatively impact people than just like, oh, this ideology is wrong because when you give the state all the power, like it just uses it against people and then like you punish dissidents and then you don't have truth and you don't have freedom. So side note on that. But anyway, so yes, when I was one of these leftists, I remember I was like at my boyfriend's house and his mom is just like the nicest person you'll ever meet in the world. Just like one of those type of people that is just does not have a malicious bone in her body, just lives to be kind and helpful and never complains. That kind of person. And so I'm in the house and I don't realize that she's in the other room and I'm getting ready to do the dishes and my boyfriend is like, oh, you don't have to do that. And I was like, of course I do. I'm not like you whites. In my household and as a Latina, my mom would never let me not wash the dishes at a guest's house. And then his mom, her voice comes in from the other room and says, oh, honey, you don't need to do that. Don't worry about that at all. And I was just like, oh, that was a joke meant for my boyfriend because he knew the context that you need to know to understand that you're not just being a racist when you single someone out for their race, but that's the thing. It actually is racist. That's why people generally read it that way. And you have to do all this like learning to take in these concepts that then tell you, oh, no, but actually, if you have white privilege and I have less of this, then that means that I can make jokes on you because I'm on a different status of the hierarchy, which means that we don't have the same systemic power. Like you have to have all this like esoteric, academic, intellectual, pseudo-intellectual background to say things like that to normal people who are not steeped in like all these kind of like regressive ideas that try to explain away what most people normally are just like, that sounds mean, And so that was just like one of those first times where I was like, wow, that really doesn't hit unless it's within this group that is seeking you to perform these certain displays that you have the right beliefs. And I just remember feeling so like icky that I had said that in that, and she heard that. And it was just like one of those moments of like coming to consciousness. And so this goes to the point of like being aligned with your values, as opposed to thinking that a political ideology is a stand-in for those values. In that moment, I was very much not in alignment with my values, but I thought that just like being of this political ideology communicated everything else that I did as ethical and good. That is not the case. And so let's go now more and speak about actually living by values and thinking through that. So I'm going to quickly look through the chat here and see if you guys have any comments. And if we have some extra time, I'll read more of the detailed parts of the study and elaborate on that a little more. Ooh, my computer is going to die. That's not good. Okay. Let's see. I like this answer. Integrity. That's a great value. That is like the values value, you know, like when you have integrity, it keeps you within all your other values. And so I think if you value integrity, it's putting you already in the right path of caring about your values and having that awareness that you need to check your actions against your values to make sure that you're actually living by them. Integrity is a great value. Let's see. Anna's values: compassion, growth, independence. I love those. Growth is one of my top values because I always find that when I am not happy with myself, when I'm finding myself on like a bad day or in a bad mood, it is usually because I feel like I'm not growing. And that's one of those good little tricks for making sure that you're within your values is noticing the opposite. Like, what is the negative state, the lack of values? And oftentimes what we are lacking is what we want as a value, what we care about most, because that's why we want it. Independence is a great value too. I like that one. So let's see what else we have. Noah's values: honesty, compassion, dependability, integrity, growth, open-mindedness, love, pluralism, multiculturalism, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, self-reliance. I like a lot of those. Freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, I don't know if that's actually a value or a principle. I think that might be, I'm getting into the weeds, but I think that might be considered a principle because it's like something that you actually, like, to have freedom of speech, you have to have freedom of speech. You know what I mean? Whereas honesty or compassion is a value because it's something that you can also choose to rank a little bit differently sometimes. You might be in a situation where someone is really suffering. They're having like a really hard time. They found out that someone has in their family is sick, and they don't know what they're going to do. And in that time, you might find that choosing honesty as opposed to compassion is less desirable, because you could be honest and say, you know what? I don't really like that family member of yours. That family member has always been mean to me, so I'm finding it really hard to empathize with you. But I do think that maybe she'll make it out and it'll be okay. You know, like that, you would want to not prioritize honesty as the top thing. You would want to prioritize compassion then. And compassion would be like, doesn't matter how I feel about this terrible relative of this person who has gotten sick. They are suffering, and I can relate to worrying about the health of a loved one. And so you lead with that. And so that's one of the interesting things that I've learned about, like the difference between compassion and principles. Now, the difference with free speech, right? Or not compassion and principles, with values and principles. The difference with free speech is that if there is ever a time when you say free speech doesn't really matter right that much right here, like here we could get rid of free speech, then you don't have the principle of free speech. And this is one of the things that people get wrong a lot with principles, is the idea that you can just not do them sometimes and still claim the principle. The principle is such because it's always true. It's always the way it is. Like, freedom of speech requires freedom of speech all the time, not just some of the time. And so to have that as a principle means to always believe and support freedom of speech. And so that's how I kind of rank the difference between values and principles. Okay, I'm gonna look in the Instagram chat. I'm gonna look here, and then we're gonna go into the other point. So let's see. I wanna see if you guys have added in some values here. No values in the Instagram chat? Guys, come on, you're killing me. Let's see here. All right. Well, if you want to add them in, I'd love to hear your values in the Instagram chat. Now let us move on over to X/Twitter. Someone says, I think oftentimes it is to protect themselves from whatever they feel weak about. How often does one see a pacifist that looks like they can handle themselves in a fight? Oh, don't come for the pacifist like that. I like the pacifists. We need more pacifists, I think. But I understand what you mean. I think we can see a lot of that kind of like overcompensation tendency in the political realm. I think it's very fascinating when you start to look at it like that, as opposed to dealing with the ideas on their face. You say, okay, this person is so intense about their belief in being a good and caring and empathetic and compassionate person. What is it where could that stem from? And you might see like, okay, well, someone who really advocates for that may be someone who themselves needs those things, right? And so that is one of the interesting things about political ideology, is it often says so much more about your hidden internal state than it does about what you think it says. Like that kind of social signaling of like, I'm such a good person because I care about the welfare of others and compassion for others and whatever. And sometimes it's like, or maybe you just really want that to be done for you. And you really want compassion, and you really want people to care about your welfare. And so it's this kind of like backwards way of overcompensating. Tell us what your values are. Good question. Well, one of my top values is freedom. And that's something that I developed as I became more outspoken, less beholden to leftism, and started doing more art and writing, because I realized that so much of my struggle with leftism as an ideology and my career was because I didn't feel free to do the things that I wanted to do. And it wasn't so much that it was like I didn't have the material freedom to do it. It wasn't like I was going to be censored by the government, but rather that I was so worried about getting attacked by an online mob that I would censor myself. And so you end up then with this lack of freedom because of you. And so I thought that was such an internal, like such an amazing concept when I realized that freedom is this internal thing as much as it is external. And so freedom is one of my values. I also value growth. Like I said, I think that's one of the things that keeps you really connected to life, which is this kind of like process of constantly evolving and pushing yourself just enough to stay fresh in life, as opposed to like getting into this monotonous way of being. And I have a lot of other values, but I think my top ones lately, the other one is courage. Courage is one of my top ones because so much of what it takes to grow and to be free is courage. And so I've found that that is often the answer that I'm looking for when I'm not sure what to do about something, when I'm not sure what choice to make. I can return to that value and say, well, what would be the courageous action here? And then it's like, oh, that's why I'm avoiding it, because it requires courage. And that's, again, one of the great things about values is that you can use them as a guide, which is what this study is so interesting for, because you have people that I'm sure they would tell you that they value helping others, but when they identify as extremely progressive, which means they probably identify with being extremely compassionate and helpful and empathetic, yet in practice, they don't take action that aligns with what they supposedly value. And so this is one of the things that I thought was really important as a takeaway from this study, which is just, are you really thinking through what you value, or are you letting political identities be stand-ins for who you want people to think you are? Here is some other values shared. Oh, you deleted it. Why? It was a great comment. I was just going to read it. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Here it is. Freedom, growth, self-reliance, creativity, honesty, intellectual humility, fun. Those are great, actually. Fun is a really good value. And fun, it sounds like trite to be like, fun is my value. But it is actually such a great value because, and I've been leaning more towards fun as a value. I think I actually told myself fun is your value now. Like recently I was like, you need to be more fun, because it's so easy to get really serious about life and really restrain, like hold yourself back from having fun and from just enjoying the moment that you're in. Because, oh, wait, I have to do this thing, or I didn't finish this thing, or I'll be happy once I get here, and all these kind of things. And it's so easy to decide to just have fun. And yet oftentimes we get out of practice of just having fun because we're serious and we're working and we're worried and there's bad news and all these things. And fun as a value is a good way to have that in your framework. So it's like, gosh, I don't feel like things are going my way lately. I don't like how my days are going. I feel unmotivated. I feel not sure of where I'm going in the future. Time to check the values. That is one of the telltale signs that you might want to check in with what you actually care about and if you're living in that way. And that's, again, this thing that you get robbed of if you come to believe that a political identity is a stand-in for values. You don't have that kind of self-examination mechanism because you just assume that embodying this identity means that you have all these traits. And the thing about values is that they always require pursuing. They're never done. You can never just achieve generosity. You're never done like, oh, that's it. I've achieved generosity. You have to pursue them forever, which I think is in stark contrast to political identities, where you get to claim, I am a moral, empathetic, caring, good person because I am a progressive or a conservative or whatever. And the more you attach to that idea that the political identity is the proof of these values implicitly, the more you lack that way to actually see if you are living in alignment with those values. And so it's not surprising to me that a study like this would show that people who are really narrowed in on that kind of like extreme progressive identity aren't in alignment with at least one of their major values. So let's see if we got some comments from Instagram here. I'm kind of disappointed, guys. Now I just want comments. I want to hear people's values on Instagram because it's the one platform that nobody gave them on. All right, let's move on to stuff with the study. I want to cover a few little things and then we will wrap up because it's late and I'm going to go see Interstellar tonight on the big screen. I'm going to go blind. All right. So one of the things about the study here, let me find my note on this. Okay. So I wanted to describe a little more like the idea of the light triad, which is one of the things that was shown to correlate with helping people regardless of their political ideology or regardless of your political ideology. And so the light triad is composed of faith in humanity, which is exemplified by the statement, I think people are mostly good. Humanism, exemplified by the statement, I tend to admire others. And Kantianism, which is exemplified by the statement, I prefer honesty over charm. So I think it's very easy to see why this would correlate with people being more likely to help others despite them being obviously in a different political group, which is you have values that supersede the importance of political agreement. And so I think this is such a great finding for the study. And it's really nice that they included this as opposed to just having it be strictly related to whether you're progressive or conservative, because it shows that it's really not so much about that as it is what values this person holds. And I mean, like I said in the beginning, you really can't always guess what someone really cares about based on whether they call themselves a progressive or a conservative, which is one of the mistakes I made when I was younger, when it was like, oh, conservatives, those are the people that hate everybody and are racist, right? That's them. You know, you have this stereotypical idea of what it is to be a conservative. And it's because you have this like narrow view and you're in this tribalized perspective where that's the out group, they're the bad ones. And it's incredible how common this is. It's something that I have increasingly just like not entertained, which is rhetoric that's just like, oh, all those people are bad. All those people are stupid. And I don't like it either way, you know, where it's leftist or right wing or whatever, because the thing is, a lot of these categories are just too broad. When I was a leftist, I wasn't evil. It's not like I'm a fundamentally different person. I just have a clear value system now. And I'm not like in this scared, insecure mode where I'm just trying to act like I know everything and prove that I'm a good person in this really like, fake way. It wasn't that I was a bad person. I was actually quite a good person. I was just a very confused person. And because of that, my good intentions were easily misdirected and manipulated toward bad ends. And so I think this kind of like generalized language where we write off entire groups of people as bad because of their political ideology it's just gotten like really out of hand, where I see people really comfortable doing this with, oh, these people voted for Trump. Everybody that voted for Trump is stupid or racist. And that's the kind of thing that it's like, you really have to stop yourself when you catch yourself in these like mass generalizations, because it takes you out of the light triad, and you want to be in the light triad. And the light triad says, I think people are mostly good. That is the faith in humanity tenet of the light triad, which I think is so important as a belief system, because if you think people are mostly good, you are more likely to treat them as such. And I think that the lack of that in the extreme progressive category of this study probably has a lot to do with the people's resistance to helping someone from their out group. They don't think those people are mostly good, thus better off not helping them. They wouldn't help me anyway. And you end up with this kind of like projection where they don't think people are mostly good, so they assume that other people would treat them the same way. And then of course you just get this like cyclical situation where people mistreat each other because they think people are going to mistreat them. So let's see what else we have here. So I think I spoke a little bit about the black sheep part already, so I'll summarize here soon. What I think is important to take away from this study in terms of the black sheep angle is that, as is true to the black sheep concept, it really is important to question that kind of political tribalism if you find yourself in a position to do so. And it's often uncomfortable. That's the entire point of the black sheep concept. That's why I started the black sheep, because I realized like I would find myself in these uncomfortable positions where I didn't agree with anybody. And I felt like if I don't say anything, they're going to assume that I agree with them because that's how this is functioning. And I don't want them to think that people all hold this toxic belief, but oh my gosh, do I have to put myself into this conflict now? And so when I learned the value of the black sheep, this idea of a person who, by way of just being slightly different and on a different beat than the group that they're within, introduces something new and keeps that group from becoming this like homogenous, orthodox, conformist, and thus stagnant or even destructive entity, it's the black sheep that does that. It's not so often the people who are opposed to the group that are the ones that can introduce that kind of challenges or different ideas that prevents a group from becoming really intolerant and conformist, and allowing people to have the illusion that everyone agrees on this thing. That was one of the big things I saw during the Black Lives Matter movement, where there was such pressure to, if you were online on social media, to post that black square. And what I think is so suspicious, it's a very sneaky thing because people don't realize they're doing it. But what ultimately that whole scenario where people were pressuring and punishing people that didn't post the black square, what it does is create the illusion of agreement. It creates this sense that everybody agrees with this ideology. Everybody is thinking the same way about this thing. See, look at all the people that are posting the black square. If you don't, it's because you're off, you're out, you don't get it, and you're one of them. And so that illusion of consensus is so dangerous because it's why a lot of people didn't say anything as these kind of like bad ideas kept developing and spreading, because they didn't see anybody else saying anything. So they thought, I guess it's just me that doesn't think this is a good idea, and maybe I just don't get it. You know, like that very typical self-doubt of like, maybe it's me, maybe I just don't understand. Maybe I'm wrong, but you know, maybe it's not worth sticking my neck out when it seems like everybody agrees on this except for me. The reality is there were a lot more people who just were thinking the same thing. They didn't see anybody expressing their doubts or different views, and so they thought it's only me that doesn't believe in this thing or has questions. And so now, having the black sheep concept in mind, I feel so much more emboldened when I'm in those kind of situations where I'm like, is it just me that thinks this is not right? Like, is it just me that doesn't agree with this kind of rhetoric or this idea? Or where I very much am, like in some kind of setting, the only one that doesn't see something a certain way, I feel much more both emboldened to, and like I have a duty to voice that other perspective. Because once I understood this concept of the black sheep, it's like, oh, that's the one person that actually is willing to say, okay, maybe it makes me a little bit of a pariah, but I'm not on the same page. And because of that person, the group isn't allowed to create this like conformist echo chamber to promote groupthink where people feel like they have to just go along or else they're going to get demonized. And it creates that kind of dialogue where it's like, okay, you don't think this is good? Okay, I kind of have questions too. And suddenly you have this actual viewpoint diversity going on, even though it's within the group, as opposed to like people criticizing a group from like way outside it. You know, like leftists aren't going to listen to conservative critics, but they might listen to their liberal friends who are not quite as extreme as they are, but say, yeah, I don't know, that doesn't resonate with me, because they're closer to the group like that. And so that that's something that I find this study is really interesting. It's like, you as a person that challenges that kind of like political extremism and introduces another viewpoint into that situation can help to reduce these situations where people attach onto political identities so intensely that they lose sight of having an actual value system, of whether their actions in the real world correlate with what they say they care about. And so let's see, I think I'm going to take a few questions, a few comments, and then we will wrap it up. Why is everything hidden here? I can't find anything. Okay, here we go. All right. Being honest is a virtue worth having. If you can look yourself in the mirror and be honest, you'll go a long way. I agree. That is probably one of the first values that I really attached onto when I started to understand the concept of values more clearly. And I remember, credit where credit is due, that it was actually Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, that really introduced me to the idea of self-deception and how real that can be. Because I really hadn't thought of it in that way, that you could lie to yourself. And it just felt like I was debating with myself or just thinking in a different way, just making excuses, whatever. It didn't feel like self-deceit. And I remember him putting it in the book so starkly. Like, I think one of the rules is don't lie, or at least don't lie to yourself, something like that. And I was just like, oh, whoa, this is such a more complex conception of honesty and dishonesty than I normally have. Because I just thought, don't lie. Yeah, don't say things that are not true. But I never really turned that around on myself to think, don't tell yourself things that are not true. Because no one who really starts out with life being like, gotta watch out that I don't lie to myself. You know me, super tricky, might lie to myself. Like, we tend to just believe our thoughts and fuse with our thoughts, as opposed to catching ourselves being like, oh no, you're making an excuse for yourself, or you're creating this narrative for yourself, how you're the victim in this situation, or how it's other people that have brought this about, and how you don't really have any power to change your situation. Like, things like this really pass as this kind of like self-deceit. And I hadn't thought of it that way before. But once I did, it just really, really helped me, because I realized, oh, wow, you're just like telling yourself some bullshit a lot of the time, and you shouldn't do that. And that made a huge difference. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you for joining. I had a lot of fun talking to everyone and going through this study with you. You can go to wetheblacksheep.com if you want to see the study in full. And there's a lot more to the study that I recommend reading. I would have liked to read more if we had more time, but it's a bit dense. See, I just love this little note here. Humans tend to categorize people into us and them, often underestimating the extent to which others share political stances. This psychological tendency reinforces divisions and reduces cooperation between politically opposed groups. This is one of the reasons why I advocate for a more individualistic mindset, because when you view people as individuals, you don't lead with that idea that I know everything about you because I know what political philosophy you affiliate yourself with. Thus, I'm going to focus on these differences and act accordingly. When we lead with individualism, we treat people as individuals, which means you don't know that individual. So you have to get to know them first before you can make vast judgments on their character and whether they're in agreement with you on everything or not. And that's what makes it hard for us to even cooperate in a society and to find common ground, is this kind of collectivist mindset where either you're in my group or you're not. It's us versus them. And you end up painting people with these incredibly broad brushes that are really inaccurate, which then just leads to more conflict, because nobody likes to be told who they are when they aren't that. And you end up picking fights with people that you don't know because you're lumping them into this big generalized group and then saying this group's a problem. When you think of it in that way, like the way that collectivism creates these large groups and says everybody in this group, I don't know any of them, Maybe I've met one or two people from this group, but everybody in this group is a problem because they're in this group. It's just like, it is such a conflict causing mode of being. My philosophy and why I think individualism is such a better approach to living and to a society than collectivism is that if I have a problem with somebody, it's with them. It's with them. It's not with their whole gender. It's not with their whole race. It's not with their whole socioeconomic status. It's with that individual. And because of that, I am at conflict with a lot less people because I have to actually have a conflict with them before I decide that everyone in a certain group is my enemy. Great way to not have a bunch of enemies is to treat people as individuals. So I hope you'll check out the study. I think it's really cool. Maybe we should go back over the study. I don't know. I just feel weird about reading a study to everybody for too long. Like, I feel like you can read it yourself. You know, what is this, story time? All right. Thank you for joining. I'm Salome Siboney. I am the founder of The Black Sheep. So please join me at wetheblacksheep.com. We've got essays that come out every week. We've got this stream, which will be multiple times a week when I am not sick. And a lot of other content revolving around this concept of the black sheep, individualism, anti-groupthink, and how to live a values-based life. So thank you for joining, and see ya on the next one.